Hey all you literary legends and luminaries, welcome to another episode of Booksmart. And today we're going back to the 90s with Chuck Klosterman's The 90s, a book. I graduated high school in 1995, so I remember the 90s well. I prefer the 80s, but I experienced more of the 90s since I was older. I love books that blend history and pop culture, and this is also an essay book, and you know how much I love essay books. I haven't decided if I'm going to keep this book yet. I'm tempted, so you know that means I liked it. I really liked it. This is the third book of Klosterman's I've read. The first one I didn't care much for, Killing Yourself to Live. It felt like it didn't go anywhere, although he did make some profound statements about telling a girl she's pretty. Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs was the second book I read by him, and that one I liked. I couldn't resist the phone on the front of this book. This is mine that I got for Christmas in 1991. It traveled with me to college, and then I used it all the way up until we eliminated our landlines. Of course, it's pink. I don't have it in me to toss it since it symbolizes so much of my high school and college existence. And since it's become almost an antique in today's technology, I thought I'd hang on to it. Because we're celebrating the 90s, I'm wearing one of my favorite dresses that I wore all the time in college. It's from 579. Remember that store? They always had the cutest shirts and dresses, although my mother always referred to them as borderline, meaning the length, or lack thereof, was pushing it. Which my mom was right, considering this dress looks like a shirt or a dress from the girls department. I currently have pajama pants on underneath it just because it's that short. And at my age, well, it still would have been shockingly short in college, but I guess I could get away with it then. My take on the 90s. I was not into flannel at all. I didn't mind Smells Like Teen Spirit, but I just couldn't understand anything he was singing. Kurt Cobain needed to enunciate more. Granted, when I was little, I thought Stevie Nicks was singing about a one-winged dove, not a white-winged one. I was an angst-ridden teen, not gothic or dark, but the My So-Called Life variety, which was my favorite show. I hated Beverly Hills 90210, so fake and materialistic. Plus, like Angela Chase, I thought Jordan Catalano was great at leaning. I was ambivalent about politics, especially when Bill Clinton gained popularity, not lost it, after the whole Monica Lewinsky thing. I believed O.J. Simpson was 100% guilty, as was Clarence Thomas. Saw Titanic in the movie theater along with almost everyone else in the world, except my husband, who still hasn't seen it, and was mortified that Jack wasn't on that floating piece with Rose. Recited lines of Seinfeld while eating in the college cafeteria.
More, these pretzels are making me thirsty.
And adored That 70s Show when it came out in 1998. Yes, Klosterman covers all of these subjects in his book, and much, much more. According to Klosterman, the bookends of the 90s is the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fall of the Twin Towers. He summarizes it as this. The boilerplate portrait of the American 90s makes the whole era look like a low-risk grunge cartoon. That portrait is imperfect. It is not, however, wildly incorrect. The decade was heavily mediated and assertively self-conscious, but not skewed and misshapen by the internet and social media. Its trajectory can be traced with accuracy. Almost every meaningful moment of the 90s was captured on videotape, along with thousands upon thousands of trivial moments that meant nothing at all. Generation X spent a lot of time trying to look like we weren't trying. We were apathetic. Every problem seemed inevitable. We were also angst-ridden. I agree, but I'd like to think we were looking at things more deeply. But we couldn't admit that that was what we were doing, since that would ruin our whole "we're not trying" image. Appropriately, ironic was the most overused word in the 90s, and yes, he does bring up how Alanis Morissette didn't use irony correctly. See, I told you we're still harping on that one. Since we're taking this trip down memory lane, let's talk about memory. This is one of the traits I love about our author. He brings up some profound ideas that you wouldn't think were on topic, yet it's the basis for the entire book. Memory is one of those things. For instance, we associate Nirvana with the 90s. It's impossible not to. Yet Shania Twain and Garth Brooks sold more albums than Nirvana. And let's not even talk about Achy Breaky Heart, because that was an atrocity of nature, and that's not me looking back on it now. That's what I said back then. Ugh. Although I did love line dances, particularly disco ones. And with Nirvana, we will forever associate the 90s with flannel. But that, too, is incorrect. Cobain is not wearing a flannel shirt in Smells Like Teen Spirit. but we all think he did. Before the days of the internet, we had to rely on our memories, which are and always have been deeply flawed. I remember when my parents would comedically argue over a detail about a movie or a song or something from the 60s, 70s, or 80s. And then when the answer was figured out months later, the winning parent would yell an, "I told you so." Because before the internet, you just couldn't Google random facts. I spent many a night in the 90s trying to figure out what other movie I had seen some random actor in. Now I can just Google it immediately so I can sleep at night. Of course, we can now argue in our current state that there is so much information that is wrong, all of that misinformation on the internet, that we aren't any better off than we were in the 90s. But since this is a book review about a book about the 90s, I'm just going to stay in the 90s. Since I brought up technology, let's talk about phones and movies and Blockbuster. I threw this in with my old name tags from retail places I worked at in my younger days. It says 2007 on the back, so that must have been the last dying days of Blockbuster. We had moved in 2001 and 2002, so this must have been our last segment of time going to Blockbuster. Klosterman ties in the video store to Quentin Tarantino and how all that eventually led to Pulp Fiction, which I saw in the theaters when I was a senior in high school and adored it after I got over its confusing chronology. My son will never get to experience what it was like to peruse the aisles of a Blockbuster. Klosterman puts much more significance on the role of video rental stores than I would have ever imagined. In regards to phones, Klosterman speaks of how the landline controlled our existence, how I hated sitting by the phone waiting for it to ring. And that is actually what you did in those days. It's not an exaggeration. I wasted a lot of time waiting for boys to call, but are we any better off nowadays? We carry our phones everywhere. Every place demands 24/7 access to our lives during work and school, weddings and funerals. I kind of miss the landline days just for the quiet, but not for the convenience or safety. Key events of the 90s, Klosterman puts in perspective of today. How more time and space was devoted to Cobain's suicide than Tupac's murder. Remember this?
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
How Monica Lewinsky wouldn't have been portrayed as the ridiculous bimbo in light of the Me Too movement, although I doubt Clinton would have lost his popularity much today either. And on a side note, after watching American Crime Story Impeachment, I feel horrible about how Linda Tripp was treated as well. And the author spends a lot of time discussing the internet, which makes sense, and states that Gen Xers and baby boomers are the two generations who experienced life before the internet and life after the internet. That's a fascinating observation. He tackles difficult subjects with thoughtful conclusions that are, in and of themselves, difficult to accept. Here's how Klosterman does so with Columbine. When something as terrible as Columbine occurs, there's a wish to have it explain something crucial about how the world is. Learning the truth is supposed to help. In this case, it did not. The truth proved there was no meaning at all, which was more terrifying than the myth. So the truth was rejected even after it was accepted. Klosterman writes of the Y2K disaster that wasn't, Ross Perot's proof that a third-party candidate mattered to the voting public, cop killers, the meaning of queer, and how Bush and Gore were like the same person. Yet Klosterman barely mentions Chad, the hanging variety. I've said it before and I'll say it again. These are the types of essay books that we should use to enhance the way we teach history, the way we learn about history, the way we think about history. We can easily agree that some of the stuff that went down in the 90s would not be acceptable today. Klosterman brings up some of these issues and even devotes an entire chapter to race, political correctness, and sexual orientation in relation to music and movies and television. And in the 90s, just like in every past decade of the world, we cringe at what we find. Klosterman wrote something regarding Clinton, something I had completely forgotten about. This is our first Black president. It was written of Bill Clinton. Blacker than any actual Black person who could ever be elected in our children's lifetime. After all, Clinton displays almost every trope of Blackness. Single-parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's and junk food loving boy from Arkansas. It now seems unfathomable that such sentiments were ever expressed non-sarcastically about any white person, Clinton or otherwise. but they were indeed expressed. In 1998, only one decade before an actual Black president was elected in a landslide. And they were expressed by Black Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison, and they were published in the New Yorker, and they were not perceived as controversial or particularly contrarian. Things of this nature were often written about Clinton, and they cannot be unwritten. The only way to escape this, it seems, is to write over these things and hope no one notices. Throughout history, and even our own personal histories, isn't there always something we wish to write over and hope no one notices? And I can't not bring up O.J. Simpson. I've read quite a bit about the case and watched The People versus O.J. Simpson, so I couldn't wait to read Klosterman's take on it. And he didn't disappoint. Let me read you this. Watching the original TV feeds of the O.J. chase is the ultimate illustration of liveness and its insidious projection of false intensity. Once you know the outcome of the chase, the actions leading up to that finale become not just boring, but borderline painful. One cannot reconnect with the feeling that this event was ever captivating. Two people had been brutally killed by a familiar celebrity. The celebrity killer was fleeing law enforcement in the most public way possible. There was a real chance he might kill himself in front of 95 million people. None of this, however, was terrifying. It was merely disturbing, and mostly because the most interested parties did not seem disturbed at all. The detail always noted in remembrances of the Bronco chase is the throngs of bystanders cheering for Simpson as the car rolled down the freeway, congregating on overpasses and holding makeshift cardboard signs proclaiming the juice is loose. It seemed perverse then and still seems perverse now. Yet this can also be understood as the primordial impulse of what would eventually drive the mechanism of social media, the desire of uninformed people to be involved with the news, broadcasting their support for a homicidal maniac, not because they liked him, but because it was exhilarating to participate in an experience all of society was experiencing at once. Klosterman said the Bronco chase wasn't terrifying, just disturbing. I don't like either of those words. It was unbelievable. It was methodical. There was an intent there, and only O.J. truly knows what that was. And the people standing along the road cheering, that wasn't just disturbing. That was disgusting. If it was exhilarating to participate in an event that everyone was witnessing, why not stand along the road with murderer signs? But his connection to social media today was fitting. I wonder how something like O.J.'s Bronco chase or murder trial would play out with social media today. Amber Heard and Johnny Depp's trial was not even close to what O.J.'s trial would have been in today's world. I realize Klosterman cannot describe every important aspect of the 90s, but some key events he either doesn't discuss at all or just gives it a quick blip. The loss of music videos on MTV, VH1's pop-up video, Princess Diana's death, as well as John F. Kennedy Jr.'s death and Freddie Mercury's death, the Mall of America, the Magnificent Seven gymnastics team with Carrie Strug's one-legged vault landing, Tanya Harding, Dr. Kevorkian. Saturday Night Live was fabulous in the 90s, and all the true crime fodder, Lorena Bobbitt, John Benet Ramsey, Jeffrey Dahmer, Mary Kay Letourneau, Amy Fisher, Betty Broderick. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was instituted during Clinton's presidency, and the FDA approved Viagra in 1998. Klosterman missed some of gems of the 90s. Maybe he should write a part 2. Better yet, write a book on the 1980s. But this is that fundamental aspect of writing anything regarding 10 years of our past and cramming it into a 350-page book. What deserves a place in the book and what doesn't? He comments on this because, of course he does. So, he says this: when staring into the shallow mirror of time, there's an intellectual inclination to de-emphasize the significance of everything super popular and prioritize off-kilter artifacts that emerge from the counterculture, often based on the paradoxical premise that the fringe invents the ideas that will become normative in the future, when they will no longer be viewed as significant. There's logic to that mythology, assuming the goal is graphing the path of a society over decades. But when you're still trapped inside a specific window of time, the prevailing forces are the forces that run the show. Anything that gets invented on the fringe is a reaction to whatever or whoever has aesthetic control. Remember the Anthropocene Reviewed, when John Green wrote, "When you're living in the middle of history, you never know what it means"? We don't. We have no idea the impact an event, a person, or even a product, like Crystal Pepsi, will have on our future and how then we will interpret its meaning in history. I don't agree with all his assessments of the 90s. For example, he writes this way at the beginning of the book. Despite an overabundance of historical information, the collective memory of the decade tends to be simplified and minimized, dedicated more by the texture of the time than by anything that transpired. And yet the texture is what mattered, the feeling of the era, and what that feeling supposedly signified. Isolates the 90s from both its distant past and its immediate future. It was a period of ambivalence defined by an overwhelming assumption that life, and particularly American life, was underwhelming. That was the thinking of the time. Underwhelming. I don't like that word. I'm trying to think about my high school and college days, which is how I spent 8 years in the 90s. At times, yes, very underwhelming. But as a whole, the entire decade? I think 1997 was one of the best years in music, with 1996 a close second. And that's coming from someone who absolutely adores 80s music. Remember these CD singles, which took the place of these cassette singles? I love Jewel, but her CD aggravated me since the versions on the radio did not match the versions on the CD, so I was forced to buy the singles. I love Sarah McLachlan, Matchbox 20, the Goo Goo Dolls. If I had to pick my theme song for those years, it would have been Jan Arden's Insensitive. While I worked on this episode, I played my favorite 90s, not from a streaming service, but on my computer, all those albums and singles I purchased long ago, and maybe some even from Napster. Remember Napster? Ah, those days of file sharing when it wasn't yet illegal. Klosterman writes about Napster, and he even mentions these. Remember these? The cardboard cases that quickly went out of vogue. I love 30-something when Lifetime played reruns when the show ended in 1991. My friends couldn't understand why I like such an old people's show. I don't always agree with some of Klosterman's biases either, but I think he did a good job not infiltrating the book with such biases. Everything we read has a certain amount of bias in it, and that was part of the fun of reading this book. I look forward to what he would write about the 90s and what his opinion or take on the topic was. If you experienced the 90s, you should read this book. If you didn't experience the 90s, you should read this book. It will make you giggle, cringe, and think about how the past shaped our present and how the present impacts what we think of the past. Let me leave you with a paragraph that sums up Klosterman's take on the 90s. Now, the 1990s seemed like a period when the world was starting to go crazy, but not so crazy that it was unmanageable or irreparable. It was the end of the 20th century, but also the end to an age when we controlled technology more than technology controlled us. People played by the old rules, despite a growing recognition that those rules were flawed. It was a good time that happened long ago, although not nearly as long ago as it seems. Thanks for traveling down memory lane with me today. And as always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.